The Bluetooth device is ready to pair.
That one, can you hear me already?
Yes, Doc.
Okay. Naka-Bluetooth nito. Naka-Bluetooth niya eh. Okay. So, okay, good morning. So, let's continue our lecture for the second semester or second bi-monthly for that matter. So, how was your exam? Okay lang? Basta yun lang, no? Okay. So, hello. So, our topic is on test for significance or hypothesis testing. So, the content of the lecture, next slide please, are the concepts of hypothesis, the t-tests, the confidence intervals, the meaning, the correlation and regression, the in choosing what tests, especially for your research on your research on the continuation of your research for methodology, and then chapter 3, what's the meaning of non-parametric tests, the statistic scenario, the top tips on how to choose right statistics in statistical tests for that matter, and analysis of variance. Okay, next slide, please. So look at the picture. Okay, look at the picture. In the picture, the cat is faced with a decision. Okay, whether to go into the snow or not, since it looks cold and wet. So it has two hypotheses. Null is that it won't get its paws wet and be cold. Okay, next slide, please. So while the alternative hypothesis will get its paws wet and will be cold. Okay, so it could be based on its decision, an objective. No, go back. Okay, that's it. Okay, it could be based on its decision on the data it collected on its mind in the past. The same with what we're going to do as well with our paper. So, so that when it went out in the snow in the past, its paws did get cold and wet, and so make the decision not to go out based on that evidence. So, hypothesis testing pervades all of our lives, all of the time, without us realizing it. We make decisions based on evidence. So sometimes they are right, they are the right ones, and sometimes they are the wrong ones. So there's a chance of getting it wrong. So we develop strategies for to minimize this risk of getting it wrong. So this is the basic frameworks of hypothesis testing. So hypothesis testing, therefore, is an objective method of making not yet decisions or inferences from sample data or evidence. Okay, so sample data are used to choose between two choices: a hypothesis or statements about a population. So we typically do do this by comparing what we have observed to what we expected if one of the statements, which is null hypothesis, was true. Next slide, please. So null hypothesis, therefore, is we have two hypotheses. Okay, so in formulating your research as well and the objectives, if you want to test for significance, you have to identify your hypothesis, whether you have to identify your hypothesis, both the null as well as the alternative hypothesis. So when we say null alternative hypothesis, next slide please. So in the context of the court case, testing hypothesis or significance is just like a court case. So members of a jury have to decide whether a person is guilty or innocent based on evidence. So null is the person is innocent, while the alternative, the person is not innocent or guilty. So the null can only be rejected. Next, if there is enough evidence to doubt it, such as the jury can only convict if there is a beyond reasonable doubt uh, for the null of innocence. So they do not know whether the person is really guilty or innocent, so they may make a mistake. So the same with our testing for significance. We don't know the result yet unless we apply the statistical test. Okay, next slide, please. So there are types of error in even in doing this test for statistical significance. There are types of error that we can we can perform. So in this 2 by 2 table, we have the study reports. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Okay. We have a 2 by 2 table. Okay. So we have the study reports on the column. We have study reports, no difference. So which means do not reject the null hypothesis, not yet. And then the study reports, not yet Chelsea, uh, reports is a difference or reject the null hypothesis. The other is null hypothesis is true. So the difference does not exist in the population, while the alternative is true, the difference does exist. So it's a 2 by 2 table. So next slide. So in here, the level of significance is correct, or your study is correct. If their study reports has no difference, so you have, we need to, or we can reject the null hypothesis, especially if the null hypothesis is true and the difference does not exist. Okay, next slide, please. On the other hand, you are also correct if the study reports states that there is a difference, so we need to reject the null hypothesis, and their alternative hypothesis is true, and that there is a difference that does exist in the population. However, errors may occur, next slide please, when the study reports states that there is a difference, so you can reject the null hypothesis, but the alternative hypothesis is true and the difference does not exist in the population. Okay, so this one is a type 1 error. Next slide, please. On the other hand, if the alternative hypothesis is true and there, which means there's a difference that exist in the population. However, your study reports does not give, or there's no difference, then it's another type of error. Okay? So type 1, there is in your report, there is a difference. So you reject the null hypothesis, but in your null hypothesis, the difference does not exist. And your another type 2 error, your alternative hypothesis does dictates difference, but there in your study reports there was no difference. So these are the two common type of error. Next slide, please. In type 1 error, typically this is restricted to a 5% risk, which is the level of significance. That's why in in stating the null hypothesis, you have to identify at what level of significance. For example, at 95% level of significance, or at 0.05 p-value, or level of significance. So that's that you will reject the null hypothesis if there's a difference, and the study report states that there is no difference. On the other hand, type 2 error, okay, because this, when the report shows that there is a difference and there is a difference, thus there is an alternative hypothesis stating that there it does exist a difference in the population. It happens usually because of the probability or the power of the test. So level of significance is an important factor. Okay. So next slide, please. For the type 2 error, it can be controlled by sample size. That's why later in the further further lectures, we will also take note. You will be able to take note that the sample population is really an important factor. So the bigger the sample, the bigger the sample, the more significant your study, or less error would occur or would happen. Okay. So next slide, please. So, okay. So these are the steps to undertake a hypothesis test. Okay. So remember in your research during your first year, you already had a definition of your study question, right? And you still remember your papers? Not anymore. Hello? Can you still remember your paper?
Not really, no.
Then remember, okay, if you have time, go back to your paper and remember again, so that on your second year or second semester we can correlate the topics. Actually, the topics for biostatistics is applicable, not really applicable. It's the one that we will be doing on your research. Okay, so that there are only some topics that we can discuss on research because it's more on the application. Okay, so if you have time, since we won't be able to finish this hypothesis testing lecture because it's very long, so go back again so you won't have an idea of what statistical tests to apply in when you formulate your methodology on your second year. Anyway, they're just the same. You look at it, they're just so that you won't have difficulty anymore. Like again, we are having problems with our test with our third year research because before it was not being the research papers were not undergoing review process, but what's happening now, all the papers are undergoing review process. So I want you to take advantage of the lectures for this first semester, as well as in the biostatistics for that matter, so that we can finish your methodology by third bi-monthly, and for fourth bi-monthly we can have your paper we can have your paper reviewed or to undergo a review process, so we can still have time to revise everything uh, if they have inputs, so that after your second year, by third year, you can start doing your data collection and start formulating the whole paper, because it's really important. That's what I've been reiterating with the third year, that it's really a requirement. The whole paper, you won't be elevated for the fourth year or to become interns if you won't be able to have present a final paper. And a review process is really an entity. It's, how to call it, it's part of the research process. So after formulation of the research protocol, it has to be reviewed by the both the ethics and the management. Usually they're joined in management committee or ethics review board of the institution. It's SOP, standard protocol. It's a standard protocol that they have to review that, because when you do your research, although it's your name as the author, but what happens is that you're bringing the name of the school as well. So there are policies and guidelines that has to be followed in conducting research. So before it was just research, the researches of the medical students were just part of the requirement, but now it is a part of the requirement, but it's also a part of the accomplishment of the institution. So for PASCO and the accreditation of the school, research output of the students are being asked. So it's an additional point if we have a reviewed and good protocols or good outputs from research. So on my end, I am amenable with it because it's the right way actually. So even if technically I already reviewed your papers, but it has to be peer reviewed and it has to undergo the review process. So what happens is, even if we already discussed and you know evaluated everything in your paper, there's still point of views and there might be policies and entities that I for myself overlook, and it's a requirement, because even in presenting the paper in a different fora, they will always ask if your papers really underwent a review process. So I'm hoping as well that RTR school would be able to present papers in outside of EVM, outside of the RTR, like at EVHRDZ, because we are a member of EVHRDZ. However, RTR is not was not active in participating in research presentations, unlike EVSO, VSU, or even LNU and other institutions. Their students are at the forefront in presenting health-related researches. So it's kind of unfortunate that we are a medical school, but we don't have research papers being presented on this fora. So I guess this is the time for that. So even if you're already in your fourth year, you can present your paper. So what's important is for that those papers, your papers, to undergo the right process. And I've been telling the third year students it's natural actually, because even if that paper already has been reviewed, it will still again be reviewed several times, like even 100 times, especially if it will be published or it will be presented in a different fora, research fora. Talagang SOP yan. even at EVMC, or not just even EVMC, at RTR and Divine Word Hospital, because I'm also doing research consultancy. Nakakadamo tong pagbabarubalikara at papel. So that's why I'm always telling the resident physicians to not delete your previous files or your initial files, because through the review process, the one that you've been initially, or the one that you initially thought of, might be asked of you during the fourth or fifth review process. So you don't delete all your files. Okay, naturally to anywhere na gigisahon ka gud talaga ani, dili ka laging gigisag, babarubalikan talaga tin kung ano ito, the context of the research paper. If I think at least at RTR there are only like 5 or 6 people who are doing the review process. So depending, if I guess it's less than 10. So depending on the number, if it's within the hospital or within the school, so the members differs. Unlike at EVNC and EVHRDC, they are like EVNC 12 or 13 that will review your paper. So if you're a resident physician, aside from undergoing a technical review for several times under me, so that paper will undergo again an ethical review composed of 12 to 13 depending on the board, um, prior to approval. So it's really, but it's part of the game. So you don't think that you're wrong or you are mistaken or something like that, but it's a way of making your paper more valuable and more credible. Okay, so kumbaga, remove that thinking nga tama na ini, damo na ning ginhing mo or whatever. No, dili patriya siya, damo pa tot ginaag yan. So even the best of the best, they have to undergo a review process. They have to undergo a peer review. Okay, so let's continue. So ang iyong nga ni paper, pwede pa tumabag o pag-abot natin sa methodology in terms of objectives. So although the same na ang iya contexto or the topic, but still anything could happen under the sun while on the chapter 3. So I hope you are done with you or can again have time to review your paper. Okay? Especially on the review of related literature and something. Please, for those, I don't know, may nagsisto adto di daha iyo ano, please review your paper on the schistosomiasis kasi dakon duruan uh there was a big mistake in terms of the mode of transmission and write up. So truhaan to, bagan mode of transmission is not ingestion but rather skin penetration. So may pagidad to dito nagsayop nga entity. Okay? So you already have a study question. So that was the title that I was reiterating. And in the objectives, so we need to set the null and alternative hypothesis as part of the objective. So unless it is being questioned or unless you want that as part of your objectives to determine the significance, ay may nagiginakan man Okay. Thank you for waiting. Dako gayon ang tingog kay kanto tambalay sa both nga side. Ba yun? Okay. So, and then once the null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis are set, we now can calculate the test statistics. Okay. And then to calculate as well the p-value and to make a decision and interpret your conclusions. Okay. So next slide, please. So in here, in this next slide, please, Chelsea, we need to choose a suitable test. Okay. So example, who among you have seen the Titanic movie? Okay. So let's have this as an example. So the ship Titanic, okay, sunk in 1912 with the loss of most of its passengers. In fact, 809 of the 1,309 passengers and crew died. So it's about 61.8%. So the research question is that did class of travel affect survival? So which means kung adi ka baha first class, second class, or third class, does it affect your survival? Okay, so the test for this, next slide, is chi-square test. Is it appropriate to do the chi-square test? So based on your first bi-monthly, we need to identify the variables, the type of variables, so that if we know the type of variable, we can identify the test statistics. So if is chi-squared tests appropriate? Okay, so since we have two categorical variables, okay, because the alternative, so the null is there is no association between class and survival. So on the other hand, the alternative hypothesis is that there is an association between class and survival. Okay, so since we have two categorical variables and want to know if they are associated, we can use a chi-square test. So class could be considered as an ordinal variable, but there are only three levels here, and so a chi-squared test, therefore, be quite appropriate. Okay, and so there are, next slide, please. So there are three rows and two columns. So in our table, and hence this is called a 3 by 2 contingency table. Okay. So whether the table suggests class and survival are connected and try to tease out that we might be better looking at the percentage of first class passengers that died or survived and compare with the percentage for the second and third class. Okay, so we have a 2 by 3 contingency table. So okay, and you observe that we have the number of those who died and the number of those who survived. Okay, so next slide, please. So what would be expected if the null is true? Okay, so same proportion of people would have died in each class. Next slide, please. So our null hypothesis states that there is no association. So whether you are in the first class, second class, or third class, the chance of dying or the mortality is still 61.8%. So that's the null hypothesis. So this is similar to the null hypothesis that we want to identify in doing our research. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. However, this figure shows the percentage that were observed, the deaths that were observed, okay, in each class, and when compared with the expected percentage. So look, it's shown as shown in the previous slide. So if you look here, the first percentage for the first class is less than 40%. Your second class is almost 60%, while your third class is more than 70%. Okay? So the first class is the lowest number of deaths, while the third class is the highest number of deaths. Okay? So the the red color, the red bars, is your null hypothesis, but your blue bars will more or less identify your alternative hypothesis. Okay? So remember, nayakan kita dito na null hypothesis. What is difference? Bisan ano nga class, pareho lagyap kadamo ang napatay in layman's term. But in alternative hypothesis, in layman's term, it says, theory may add a difference. Kung ang napatay, depende han class kung diin ka nagsumakay. Okay? So, next slide, please. So, in chi-squared test, it actually compares observed and expected frequencies. Okay? So, expected number of dying in each class was 0.618 or in the number in class. So, this slide shows the chi-squared test formally compares the observed frequencies with the expected frequencies. Okay? So, next slide, please. So the chi-squared test is used when we want to see if two categorical variables are related. The test statistics for the chi-squared test uses the sum of the squared differences between the observed, each pair of observed and expected values. Okay, next slide, please. So in that formula, if we use the SPSS, okay, this the tool, the SPSS tool. Next slide, please. I think I forgot to. I think I did, but it's in the measures for central tendency. There were lectures on the different softwares. Can you, if you go back to that, to the last PowerPoint that I gave you, there was a lecture on the different types of software, and one of which is SPSS. Okay, so if SPSS is used, then SPSS, the key information, it will point out the p-values. Okay, so analyze the SPSS will just analyze, will perform descriptive statistics in doing cross tabulations. So we can click on the statistics button and select for the chi-square. So these are the two key items of information. These are the blue and the red one are the two key items of information. And also look, the p-value is not 0, but rather it's less than 0.001. So again, if that's p-value is 0.001, the statistical significance, the level of significance is 99%. Okay, so also the degrees of freedom, the p-value to the 3 degrees of freedom. So the SPSS reports no leading 0 in the p-values, and so we just have to rewrite the p-value, so less than 0.001 if it's 0.00. Okay, so Next slide, please. So in that figure, next slide, please, Hannah. So look in your slide, the p-value is 0, but there is no 0. You can click it; it will give out more decimal points. But since we don't have, we just have to, since it's 0 already, but our p-value is less than 0.001, we have to write it in our paper. Okay, so next slide, please. So hypothesis the testing decision rule, what would be this decision, knowing that you have that result from the SPSS? So we can use statistical software again to undertake. That was the SPSS. So one part of the output is the p-value. Okay. So if p-value, next slide, is 0.05, less than 0.05, then we can reject the null hypothesis, because the evidence of alternative hypothesis being true is that there is no association, there is association. Okay. Well, so therefore, if we reject the null hypothesis, the alternative hypothesis is true. On the other hand, if the p-value is more than 0.05, we cannot reject the null hypothesis, which means there is no association. Okay? Okay. So if the p-value is less than the set value, then we can reject the null hypothesis. We can reject the no. There's no significance. So what would happen is the alternative hypothesis would be accepted, which means if if we're talking of that, if we're talking of this Titanic as an example based on the SPSS result, then the evidence of alternative hypothesis being true, wherein there is a significant difference in the class in survival, is accepted. Okay, next slide, please. So this slide is it illustrates what the chi-square distribution looks like, and that as the degrees of freedom increases, so degrees of freedom, look at the DF, the amount of independent pieces of information we have from the study, then the wider the distribution is spread and becomes flatter. Okay, so the p-value is calculated using the chi-squared distribution for this test. Okay, the chi-squared is a skewed distribution which varies depending on the degrees of freedom. Okay, so again, the degrees of freedom is the relationship between the two, which means the number of rows minus 1 over the number of columns minus 1. So in one sample test, the degrees of freedom is equals to outcomes minus 1. Okay, so the higher the degrees of freedom, the flatter or the wider the distribution spread. Okay, so next slide, please. So what's the p-value? So we mentioned already the p-value. Okay, so technically the p-value is the probability of getting a test statistics at least as extreme as the one calculated if the null is true. Okay, so for example, in Titanic, the probability of getting a test statistics of 127.859 or above if the null is true is less than 0.001. So which means since in here the p-value is less than 0.001, then what we can do is to reject the null hypothesis, which means the probability of having that uh, that, uh, that there's no difference in the chance of survival or the chance of death is not acceptable. Okay, next slide, please. So in the interpretation of that, since the p-value that was set is less than 0.05, we reject the null hypothesis since the result was even less than 0.001. So which means that the level of significance or the margin of error is very small. Okay, so which means that there is an evidence that the chi-square, which is 127.86, which has a p-value of 0.001, suggests that there is an association between class and survival, because we can reject the null hypothesis that there is no difference between the class, or there is no association between the class and survival. But since this is less than the p-value that we want, that was set, then we can reject the null hypothesis. So, but what is the nature of this association or relationship? Okay, it's a one-tailed relationship. So, next slide, please. So for that exercise, okay, in the Titanic exercise, okay, the question again was, were wealthy people more likely to survive on board the Titanic? Okay, so to continue with to understand the chi-square test in the distribution, the null and the alternative hypothesis is that option one is to choose the right percentage from the next slide to investigate. So we need to fill in the stack bar with the percentage. Okay, so the question of kung mas riko ba, mas hataas ang chance kung nga mapubuhi ra as compared kung diri. Okay, so next slide please. So if we look at the percentages for investigating, we can already identify, we can already make some, summary or descriptions of the question. Okay, so there are two ways on how that presentation could be shown. It could be in column and it can be in rows. So in column, the those who died and survived, and the rows are the classes.